and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders of the past, present and emerging. Well, we're surrounded by pessimism, aren't we? The news is always bad. People are making predictions about destruction and how bad the world is shaping up. So I wanted to explore the pleasures of pessimism. Yes, the pleasures. And the reason I am is because the author of that book is Dr. Natasha Moore, my guest today on the podcast. Natasha is a research fellow at the Centre for Public Christianity. She has a Ph.D. in English Literature from the University of Cambridge and is the author of For the Love of God, How the Church is Better and Worse Than You Ever Imagined. And we explore that in this podcast, as well as her more recent book, The Pleasures of Pessimism. She's worked at the Centre for Public Christianity since 2014 and written on topics that include books, movies, politics, food, domestic violence, scriptures in the school, war, Thanksgiving, and the freedom of speech. I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Dr. Natasha Moore. Welcome to the show, Natasha.
Thanks so much for having me.
Natasha, so much I wanted to talk to you about today, and the doctor aspect of it is one that we just touched on before we came on, but I think this will come up as I asked you, what brought you, I'm interested in your journey and what brought you to this point professionally?
My background is in English literature. I love books. I'm a book person. This is not staged, behind me.
This is, we just...
You got to get the books in the corner.
Okay.
This is 2020, right? Bookcase credibility. So I did my PhD over in the UK in Victorian poetry, and I fully intended to be an academic. That was kind of my plan. I love the university as an institution. I love research and teaching and so on. Finished my PhD at the end of 2011. There were no jobs in my field. Surprise, surprise. So I kind of did a few things on and off here and in the UK and in the US, and worked with your lovely wife at UNSW, wonderful boss that she was.
She was humbled, incidentally, to have a PhD as a research assistant. She was.
Well, I was delighted to have that job. It was not an easy job market for us poor PhDs. And then the job that I currently do came up as kind of a 1-year maternity cover job. And I was like, I definitely want to be an academic, but this was in media, kind of uniting interests of mine. So as someone who's a Christian and as someone with an interest in kind of academic research, I felt like, learning to write for the media in those two areas would be kind of a helpful string to have to my bow. And then it turned out to be kind of the best job in the world. And I haven't looked back. So I've been at CPX, the Centre for Public Christianity, nearly 7 years now. And, we're a media company. We exist to be a Christian voice in the public square. So religion is something that's not often well understood or well covered or well represented within the media or within some parts of the media. And, often the Christian voices that are heard in public are kind of the ones at the extreme ends and don't necessarily represent what most people of faith believe or think about the world. And so we really wanted to kind of contribute to a public square that is more generous to those who disagree, that's more engaged across lines of difference, where we can talk about the things that we believe about reality and about the big questions of our day in ways that are positive and constructive and not just kind of shouting matches.
Well, it's nice to hear that that this centre ground is being inhabited and it got a voice, because I know I had the pleasure of seeing one of your projects, which was a documentary that you'd done with your team for the love of God, how the church is better and worse than you ever imagined. And it was terrific. We really enjoyed it. Can you tell us a bit about that documentary?
Yeah, this was a really large project, something we started working on soon after I came on board with CPX. And we because we looked around and kind of at the conversations we're having as a culture, and particularly around religion and history, and realized that people, whereas maybe 20 or 30 years ago, people might say, oh, Christianity is kind of irrelevant and outdated and it doesn't really have anything, to do with my life, that much more people were saying, actually, I'm really suspicious of religion and suspicious of the church because religion poisons everything, in the words of Christopher Hitchens in his book, God is Not Great, that actually the church causes all this harm and its history is terrible. It's done all these awful things. So, I would never kind of listen to anything that they have to say, or and we'll all be better off without religion. And so we really wanted to kind of dive into that conversation that people are actually having. Every time that we write something for the ABC or the Sydney Morning Herald or wherever it might be, we'd get comments which were like, "Oh, the Bible, promotes genocide and." Christians they just hate lots of people. And so we were like, okay, well, this is something that we want to engage with. And first and foremost, to acknowledge that there are a lot of skeletons in the church's closet. These things aren't coming out of nowhere. There is fire where there's some of this smoke. And so we wanted to emphasize that the church is better and worse than you ever imagined, to say, yeah, let's talk about some of those awful things about crusades and inquisitions and child abuse and, greed, so many kind of failures and harm that the church has done. But at the same time, there's another story which people don't know, including a lot of Christians don't know, which is how Christianity has actually shaped the world that we inhabit, and a lot of the things that we like about the world we inhabit, things like human rights and universal healthcare, things like humility as a virtue, all these things that we kind of take for granted that are really not self-evident and were not the case 2,000 years ago, and are actually so ingrained that we've forgotten that they have a history. So we really kind of wanted to tell those stories as well, and give people the tools to, we use an analogy in the documentary, and I wrote the book afterwards, writing up all this material. We talk about the difference between a composition and its performance. So we talk about kind of Bach's cello suites, some of the most beautiful music ever composed. And one of my colleagues, John Dixon, who's one of the presenters of the documentary, he sits down. He is a musician, but he's not a cello player. And he sits down and tries to play the cello suites, the first cello suite. And of course, it doesn't sound anything like it should. But we know not to judge Bach based on the performance of one person who doesn't know how to play the cello. And so we want to talk about, the teachings of Jesus, his life, his example, following him as kind of that he wrote this beautiful tune. And when Christian people have played in tune with him, that's achieved great things in the world, civil rights, care for the poor, abolition of slavery, all these things that we value. When Christians have played out of tune, that's been really awful and caused a lot of harm. But, that's a helpful way of kind of going back to the original source and going, okay, well, what did Jesus say? And is what Christians are doing and saying, is what the church is doing in line with that, or is it a departure from that?
Yes, well, boy, we could divert at this point and go off on a tangent.
Sorry, there's a lot there.
There's a lot there, Natasha, because, you made the qualifier at the beginning by saying there are extremes on either side, and the Centre for Public Christianity is a voice for that middle ground. And, I think we need louder voices for the middle ground right across the board. I mean, I actually am a firm believer, and this gets to the point of what we're talking about today, the pleasures of pessimism. I actually believe the vast majority of people are really good. want the best for themselves and their family and their community. It's just the louder voices tend to be the extreme voices, and we get distracted by that.
The exhausted middle, yes.
The exhausted middle.
I mean, the problem is that, you can't be generous and open and honest and, moderate in some ways, in a shouty way. Like, those are mutually exclusive. So the people who are shouting are often going to be easier to hear, and you kind of have to go looking for voices that are more reasoned and reasonable and worth engaging with, I think. So there's the advantage of shouting, but I think ultimately it's self-defeating.
Well, we're gonna touch on a little bit later on about how communication has come back to bite us and polarize us, and you've touched on that. And I was going to ask you, because the byline of the documentary, and I think you've kind of touched on it already, because the byline is how the church is better and worse than you ever imagined. And I was interested that you had gone through this intense period of producing the documentary and the book. And so for you personally, how the church is better than you ever imagined? Or did you come away from it thinking, wow, that was it's even better than I thought?
I really did. It was a really interesting process for me researching this, because I feel as though, I have some degrees, like by any general standard, I'm highly educated. I've been a Christian for a couple of decades. So I've been in churches. I'm kind of interested in this stuff. So you'd think the combination of those things would mean I'd know about a lot of this history, but I really didn't. I think I really had kind of bought into a lot of the sort of the rhetoric that's cycling about. I was kind of like, oh yeah, the history of the church, there's a lot of crap there. And I didn't know things like I probably would have believed that human rights comes out of the Enlightenment or the French Revolution, and not have connected it to these ideas that are central to Christianity and also to Judaism about every human being made in the image of God. This is kind of like probably the most revolutionary idea in history. But I kind of didn't know about that genealogy of, these underpinning ideas to our culture. And so for me, it was, there was a lot of, I think it's overclaiming to say trauma. I don't want to overuse that word, but it was kind of intense and difficult to read about some of the really awful things and to dive into that and immerse myself in that. But it was also really heartening to be like, oh, well, actually, things are dramatically different to how they were 2,000 years ago. And a lot of things are way better. There are things that we take for granted that I'm actually, once you look at their history, I'm like, I'm really glad that we're here and not there. And so I found that really heartening. I kind of, this question of like, well, does religion do harm? Does it do good? Like, is Christianity good for people or bad for people or whatever? It's a different question to, is it true, right? And I'm not all for like, oh, well, we should have more religion because it's good for you or it's good for society. Because if it's not true, then, what are we doing? But I think that it is interesting and suggestive. And for me, as someone who does believe it, I kind of go, oh, well, the fact that it has kind of transformed things very slowly and in very kind of with a very patchy record, that's what you would expect to happen, really, if it were true. If God actually has acted in history and sent his son, and people who follow him are people who are kind of being reconnected and in a slow kind of stumbling way trying to do good, you would expect that to have an impact. And so for me, it was kind of like, oh yeah, this does actually make sense. Why haven't I thought of this before?
I think the thing that you pulled out there, that we were made in God's image, is such an interesting concept, really, because I guess up until that point it was maybe sun worshipping or other idolatry worshipping, but bringing it down to a human level would have made it a lot easier to relate to in many ways. But then taking that too far, one could almost argue that gave permission for humans to take on this godlike role, which we seem to have done. in society. So it's a loaded gun in many ways.
Yeah, that's interesting because, in the ancient world, you had this idea of the image of God in some cultures. The pharaoh was an image of God. Like the important people were kind of God on earth, but most people were worth nothing. Like you have kind of many, many people are slaves, many people are women or children. They're just not worth anything. They're disposable. It's like a brutal culture. It's a brutal society. And so then to say, actually, no, every single person has something of the divine, this like imprint on them, and you can't just treat them like they're not worth anything is dramatic. I guess, within kind of that Judeo-Christian idea and value system, the value of the person is guaranteed in relation to the God. So, the Bible is kind of like, well, you can't treat people like that because God values them. And if you want to obey him, if you want to kind of be in line with what he's doing, you can't treat them like they're not valuable. I guess once you take God out of the picture, but want to keep the image of God, like the individual value of humans, then that could go in all kinds of directions. So it can erode. It can be like, well, who says humans are equal? They're not self-evidently equal. Like we're pretty different, actually. And do we all have to treat each other the same? Or I guess it can go in the direction you're talking about, that we go, well, we can make of ourselves whatever we want, and maybe even the more transhumanist kind of directions that are being suggested now of, well, can we kind of make this leap in evolution where we become a completely different race and we have our fate in our own hands? And, I read a lot of dystopian novels, so I'm not super optimistic about that.
Well, I don't think we'll have an argument about saying that we have certainly shaped the world in perhaps in many positive ways, but also in very negative ways. But that brings us to the book, which is The Pleasures of Pessimism. And I was certainly drawn to the title. What is the difference between prudence and pessimism?
Depends who you ask, doesn't it?
Well, I'm asking you, Natasha. I'm asking
because
you.
every pessimist would just say they're a realist, wouldn't they? Every pessimist would say that they're just being prudent. Because the way that I started thinking about this topic was that I read some things about cultural pessimism. So, we're kind of, as individuals, we have slightly optimistic or pessimistic or extremely optimistic or pessimistic bents. But I think as a culture, the way that we think about, well, how is our collective life going? Is it getting better and better, onwards and upwards? Is it kind of all falling apart? We've become more and more, I think, on the negative scale of that. And I think to some extent you could judge the distinction at that level between prudence and pessimism by its outcomes. Does our concern, our anxieties about the future, our fears for the future, do they make us more engaged, more eager to kind of meet the challenges that we have, to fix the problems, to engage with each other well, to build something good? Or do they make us kind of paralyzed and apathetic? Do they make us more suspicious of each other? And I think there's a pretty strong argument that's mostly what's happening, right? Go on Twitter.
Yes.
That's what's happening.
Yes. Well, we seem to be creating our own reality, but we're also really drawn to catastrophe. There's something we love about it. We're almost addicted to it. I think, did you use the word? There was a catastroholic or
Apocalyptic.
Apocalyptic,
yeah.
yes. And
I didn't coin it, by the way. I wish I had, but I have.
That's okay. But
I use it.
But we love horror movies. We love crime. And you've outlined a whole smorgasbord of other catastrophes. Just run a few of those past our list.
Well, there's kind of the fictional ones, and then there's the news ones, right? So certainly we've been telling ourselves, like, we have a steady diet of dystopian, post-apocalyptic disaster stories that we feed ourselves, from, zombie apocalypse to kind of more Orwellian futures, and we just can't get enough of that. That picture of the future that's terrifying and just very bleak, that instead of having progress, we have massive decline. And we do love those stories. And then, of course, we have the news, which is in some ways not that different, even pre-2020, which is kind of, been relevant to this discussion. So much of what we think about in terms of the way that the future is going to go, we couch not just as like, oh, this might go wrong, but we couch in kind of apocalyptic terms. So,
Yes.
IQ rates are dropping. We might be entering a post-antibiotic age. Weapons of math destruction. This is a book that my book club read earlier this year. Cancel culture. Have smartphones destroyed a generation? This is one of my favorites, Tinder and the dawn of the dating apocalypse.
You mentioned that. I love that.
Like, that idea of it's not just, this might be getting worse. It's actually, this is the end of the world in this particular, pocket of our culture. I've came across this term earlier this year, which kind of makes sense of 2020, of doom scrolling, that this is a habit we've developed, that, we don't just kind of think, oh, some things might be going wrong. We actually go, everything is doom and gloom, and are we going off a cliff kind of thing. So I think we've developed this habit, and the news cycle kind of reinforces this, right? Because to get attention, the kind of clickbaity habits we've developed, you really have to couch things as a disaster, or people won't pay attention.
But often it's not just the news, it's the experts that are very focused in their narrow area that see, and that kind of almost reinforce the apocalypse. I mean, the current pandemic is a good example. I think the early predictions were that we would, in Australia alone, have 40 or 50,000 deaths, and it would be, an apocalypse. And that was coming from the experts. So, how come experts are getting it so wrong? What do you think?
I mean, I don't know about, and it depends on which data you're looking at and the predictions and how they couch them. Because, of course, part of the reason for laying out these kind of dire timelines is so that we can do something about it and avoid it. So if you compare the projections in the US and the projections here, well, the projections in the US have come true or are even worse than they thought. Whereas here we acted early and made sacrifices, made good decisions, and we're also lucky in a lot of ways. And so, thankfully it hasn't gone that way. So I couldn't really make a pronouncement. I'm no expert on this as to whether their modeling was wrong. But, in that case, it certainly seems to have done the job, that we took it seriously. And therefore we can have Christmas the way we normally do.
Yes, amazing. I mean,
thankful for that.
I mean, I reflect, and I've spoken to many people on the from America, from the States, and actually the UK as well, and it's not a pretty picture, and yet they reflected on what we were doing and saying, God, you're like a fascist. It's a fascist country you're living in. Look, they're demanding this lockdown. And I kind of see what's gone on as a choice between the collective good or the individual right to do whatever I want to do. I think essentially the response is a choice between that.
Yeah, I mean, and if you don't have the levels of public trust, if that's been eroded as it has, particularly in the US over the past several years, it's very hard to marshal the goodwill or the willingness to believe that your government is for you and is worth heeding. I mean, in terms of the kind of apocalyptic predictions, I found living through an actual pandemic so obviously it's been terrible and horrific in a lot of ways, but there are a lot of things that are fascinating about an experience like this, particularly when you're in the situation we're in, where we've been so fortunate as to not experience the worst of it. But right at the start, back in March, when things were starting to kind of get really serious and a bit scary, I read Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. I don't know if you know the novel.
Don't know.
I think it's from 2014, and it's a novel about a civilization-ending flu pandemic.
Okay.
It's brilliant. It's written kind of partly at the time and partly, 20 years later, from the point of view of this traveling group of actors and musicians who are going around to the few settlements that remain in North America, performing Shakespeare, because that's what people want. They kind of, because survival is not enough, is the Star Trek kind of moral that they use. But reading this, this is a flu that kind of, you catch it, you're dead within 24 hours. Almost nobody survives. So it's a very different sort of, thing to what we've been experiencing this year. And I think that's quite instructive, because a lot of the apocalyptic scenarios we project, which are always like, everybody dies. And actually, like, not that that's impossible. There are the possibility of an extinction level event is, it's not impossible. But actually, most of the time, even the most extreme situations that we find ourselves in as societies and as individuals, it's more of a muddle through and you have to navigate a lot more complexity than just, everything is over, civilization is over, now we have to kind of scrounge something out of nothing. So actually a lot of those scenarios haven't helped us that much in thinking through, okay, well, here's a very serious illness that we have to take dramatic steps to address, but it's not going to kill everybody. And, we do have to care about the economy. There's still a government. It's not, it's not the end of the world. And those are the kinds of, that kind of engagement with reality is what we need. As it doesn't make as interesting a movie, right? But it's those kinds of engagement with difficult, complex, messy reality that we actually have to marshal to meet the challenges that we really have, and not the kind of imaginary blockbuster ones.
Yeah. It's interesting because when experts are consulted, they're invariably experts in their field. And it's easy to lose sight of the whole picture. And a word that comes to mind, that's come to my mind professionally for almost 40 years, is holistic. And on the one hand, it's often, it is seen as some kind of new age philosophy, but it actually just happens to be the way the world works. So, hey, get on board. But listen, there was another thing that I loved. You had this quote from Woody Allen, who wrote, "More than any time in history, mankind faces crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose correctly." So that was in 1979. How do you think we're doing?
I think we could use some of his sense of humor about our own apocalypsism. Yep. Is what I think. And I don't say that because I think we should minimize the very real kind of problems that we face. But because I think that, and, he's kind of satirizing there our tendency to be negative about the future. All our choices are terrible. And
who better than Woody Allen?
That's right. He does grumpy. And
he does it very well. Impressive. But we talk, it's almost like this thirsty, and you've identified it as the golden past, but, the evidence, and let's face it, evidence counts for something here. It doesn't really stack up. And you reference a fellow by the name of Hans Rosling. I wonder if you might share with our listener who he is, and then we might share another screen in a moment. Oh, this is so good, Natasha. I mean, we're going audio on this as well as video, so we will make this work audio-wise, but this is a good reminder as to why people should tune in on the video.
That's right.
But go on, tell us about Hans Rosling, because I find it fascinating.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was kind of going around in circles on as I thought about this topic of pessimism was, on the one hand, you have kind of the doomsayers, and there's a lot going for them. You look at what's happening with climate change, and you're like, yeah, this is really dire. Maybe everything is going to, it's heading somewhere very bad. And on the other hand, you have these kind of optimists who are like, hey, look, there is no golden age of the past. People have been saying for centuries that everything is, just about this is the end of all human progress and everything's downhill from here. And look, that hasn't really happened so far. Let's chill a bit. And, they marshal plenty of data for that as well. And so I was like, well, I care about that data and they're right. Like, PJ O'Rourke, the humorist, talks about how if you think there was a golden age from the past, I've got one word for you: dentistry. Relevant quotation for you.
I saw that. Yes, that's so true.
You don't want to live 100 or 200 or 600 years ago. Our teeth don't. No. But someone who resolved this quite helpfully for me was reading Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness. So he was a Swedish public health expert, a doctor. He, worked with Doctors Without Borders. He discovered a new disease somewhere in Africa when he was younger. He has been working for decades. He kind of threw everything up and went to help with the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014. That's when that was. So, he's kind of frontline guy. And then for decades, he's been going around talking to kind of people from the UN, from governments, from aid and development organizations, to students, to politicians, and talking to them about, okay, what do we know about the world? How is it changing? How has it changed? And he wants to say, actually, things are a lot better than even those people who are most involved with fighting the problems. Even they don't realize how much has changed for the better. And what I really liked about his take, so he's kind of agreeing with a lot of the data that the optimists are pushing at us, but he says that doesn't mean that it's all okay and that we should look away. If people kind of hear it as, oh, things are getting better, and they go, therefore I don't need to worry about it anymore. And he's like, no, things can be both bad and better. So he's not someone who's like, it's fine, shush.
Yep.
He cares a lot about extreme poverty. He worries a lot about, he actually, quotes in the book, I think he lists 5 things that he's like, these are the things that keep me up at night that could go really wrong. And one of those is a global pandemic. So, he was not kind of unrealistic or unaware of what could go wrong, and has done a lot of work to make things better in the world. And I found, that kind of approach where he's like, okay, we need to pay attention to the actual data and work with that, partly so that we can keep making things get better. And he's just, I really recommend the book to everyone because it's such a lovely read. He's so likable, and everything that he has to kind of tell us is so surprising, but also, once you think about it, so obvious.
Well, he sadly, he's no longer with us. And he was very famous for presenting really eloquently on YouTube. You can go on and look at some of his amazing presentations, and he usually finishes a presentation by demonstrating a sword swallowing technique that he does. Did you see that?
Yes,
but listen, I think he also put together this questionnaire that you answer, and you kind of how to keep in touch with reality in the modern world. And I might. Have you got that up on your screen?
Yeah, the factfulness quiz.
Yeah. I think
Shall we do the factfulness quiz?
Well, let's do it. And we don't have to. Well, yeah, let's go through a few of the questions and see how we go.
Do that.
Because I think this is a good thing for our listener to see how in touch with reality you are.
Okay, in all low-income countries across the world today, how many girls finish primary school? 20%, 40%, or 60%? How are we going to do this? Are we going to put what we...
Yeah, let's put it what we think. Go on, tell you.
Well, I've read the book.
I've done it too. So. It's a bit of a cheat. Let's not do it. But let's put in 60%. I know a lot of people...
Let's put in 60.
It is 60. Yep. Let's answer it how we know the answer.
Where does the majority of the world population live? Low-income countries, middle-income countries, or high-income countries? So we know that the answer is actually middle-income countries, even though most people would probably say low-income
income, yeah.
countries. In the last 20 years, the proportion of the world population living in extreme poverty has almost doubled, remained more or less the same, or almost halved. And actually, we know
It's almost halved. Now,
halved.
it's worth pausing at that point because that does surprise people. And I think it's worth defining what extreme poverty is. And it is extreme poverty. I mean, I think it's earning, less than $1 a day?
I think $1.90 is the
a day or
cutoff.
a week? A day?
Yeah,
but it's also having a dirt floor and no electricity. So extreme poverty is, as it says, extreme poverty. But go on, yeah.
What is the life expectancy of the world today? 50 years, 60 years, 70 years? And, I think a lot of us would say, well, it's up in kind of the 70s in the developed world, but not elsewhere. But actually, the average across the world is 70 years.
Yep.
And then, there are questions about there are 2 billion children in the world today. How many will there be in the year 2100? And actually, even though we have these nightmare scenarios in our head of, runaway global population, the population of the world is expected to level out by the end of the year. So it's actually that there'll be, we think, the same amount of children in 2100 as there are now. And, maybe I'll actually have a slide which we could do the whole quiz, but, it's all that kind of thing.
Yeah. No, that's good. And I'd recommend people do it because it's actually really insightful as to how real, and as you say, how improved the world has actually improved. Lots to do. And you've identified he's got 5 things that he's concerned about. And I'm fairly sure that environment would be up there amongst the 5 of them.
And he kind of, so if I have a couple of slides around this that I think, there he is, Hans.
Yes, very tragic that he died because he wasn't old at all.
No, so he died just before the book came out. But so, this is, he does these great kind of graphs. Usually these are kind of colorful, but the one that didn't have the year on it, I had the black and white one. So, and he says, this is how most of us picture the world. There's, a bubble graph with most people in the world have big families and many children die. In the developed world, people have small families and not many children die, low infant mortality, low numbers of children. And we think that that's, the majority of the world's population is down that end of the graph, and only some of us are up this end of the graph. And he says that is an accurate picture of the world in 1965. Right. That is not what it looks like today. This is what it looks like today.
Wow.
It's that there's only a few people, well, I mean, in raw numbers, it's still far too many people,
yes.
Of course, who are in the big families, lots of children die box. But actually the world has been getting wealthier and in many ways better off.
Yeah.
And if we think, one of the problems with thinking actually that's not the case, we're thinking that this picture, the former picture, is how the world is and how it's always going to be, means that we get a bit, like, well, what can we do about it? We've been like going on about extreme poverty, particularly since the 80s, and look, it's never going to change. Whereas to celebrate that change and to say, look, some of the things we've been doing have changed people's lives dramatically and are having an effect. Let's celebrate that and use that as, a launching point to continue to make things happen. Whereas, of course, this is a
this is the answers of those questions.
Yeah, this is one of the questions as an example. So he went round to all these kind of conferences and organizations in all these different countries and did that quiz. And people got the answers so wrong. Like, not just, he says, if you had a chimp throwing bananas at like A, B, and C randomly, not knowing what the questions were, the chimp would do better than almost everyone.
Well, this question that you've got up in front of us is the response to question 9, which asked how many of the world's 1-year-olds today have been vaccinated against some disease. And the correct answer is 80%.
Yeah,
80% of 1-year-olds.
And that's globally. So, the options I think were kind of maybe 40%, 60%, or 80%. And not many people. So, the Swedish did the best in this question. 21% of people got it correct.
Got it correct.
Down in France and Germany and Japan, it was 6%. Australians got 14% of us
wow.
who he did this quiz with got it right.
It's a real indication, isn't it, as to across the world how wrong we've got it. Which is interesting, because another thing you mention in your book, Natasha, is that when people are asked about how life is for them, they invariably say, yes, it's good, it's better than it was. But out there in the world, it's much, much worse, which is maybe one of the pleasures of pessimism, or maybe it's one of the side effects of pessimism. But
that's right. And Rosling talks about this as a thing to think about, that we kind of go, oh, well, out there, all these terrible things happen and the world is kind of a terrible place. And he says, well, of course, more bad things happen out there than where you live, because almost regardless of where you live, right? Because out there is a much bigger place. And we only hear about so many of these places when terrible things happen, and the rest of the time we're oblivious. And, I think this particularly feeds into, so partly that's a function of just, that's how the world is. We hear a lot of the bad news from all these different places, but there are also a lot of good things happening that we don't hear about. But on the other hand, there's something else going on there, which I think really feeds into the polarization of our kind of cultural experience and conversation, which is that, and I found this particularly interesting in terms of the US. There's surveys done, and this is before 2016, before Donald Trump was elected, where people going around the country doing surveys found that there was this massive gap between, if you ask, how is the country going? What are things like at this kind of up here national collective level? And people would be like, very badly. Is America going in the right direction? No. But when asked about their own lives and their own capacity for pursuing the American dream, they'd be like, oh yeah, it's good. Their actual experience of their lives and their communities doesn't match up to this narrative they have in their heads about the country as a whole. And that's, was kind of true across party lines as well. And, they'd have different ideas about what's wrong with the country at large. But it's interesting that, people kind of go, I believe this thing about the nation that I have no direct experience of. I only know about it through the news. And that doesn't bear any resemblance to my real experience of my life and the lives of people around me. That gap is important, I think.
Yeah, and what you brought this up, this is the next thing I was going to ask you, really, about polarization. We live in an extremely polarized world, and you ask this very relevant question in your book: which do you value more, the common good or my side to be right? And I'm fascinated about our ability to communicate. I mean, there's no argument. It's brought us to the top of the food chain and controlling our environment. But I'm kind of seeing that our ability to communicate is coming back to bite us. How do you think we can reconnect our individual realities, because that's really what's going on, into some sort of cohesive society, if ever such a thing existed? But I mean, the Centre for Public Christianity is attempting to do just that. But how do we get on? How do we do that more?
Yeah, trying to do our bit. Can I share with you a quote? That this is actually the quote that got me started on the whole kind of pessimism journey. This is from one of my favorite writers, Marilyn Robinson. She's an American writer, novelist, and essayist. And she writes this. She says, this was in the middle of an essay, and I kind of just read it and was like, whoa, I hadn't kind of thought of this in these terms, but this so describes the water we're swimming in, She says, cultural pessimism is always fashionable. And since we are human, there are always grounds for it. It has the negative consequence of depressing the level of aspiration, the sense of the possible. And from time to time, it has the extremely negative consequence of encouraging a kind of somber panic, a collective dream state in which recourse to terrible remedies is inspired by delusions of mortal threat. If there is anything in the life of any cultural period that gives good grounds for alarm, it is the rise of cultural pessimism, whose major passion is bitter hostility toward many or most of the people within the very culture the pessimists always feel they are intent on rescuing. And she goes on, but I think that's worth kind of pausing on, that idea that actually cultural pessimism becomes sort of it's self-poisonous and self-fulfilling, because, our pessimism is not just like, oh no, things are going badly. I think there's this really partisan element to our pessimism where it's like, it's not just that things are going off the rails. Actually, those people over there, whoever they might be for us, they're driving it there. And so if we've lost that sense of like, oh, actually, we're on that train together. We're going somewhere together and we want all of us to kind of get there in one piece. Once we've lost that and it's like, oh, I just want my people to be okay and I don't care about those people. If we don't have that sense of a common good, then that makes it very difficult to tackle particularly large-scale things like climate change. So she goes on. She says, and this is part of, I think, your the answer to your question about, well, what do we do about it? She says, when panic on one side is creating alarm on the other, it is easy to forget that there are always as good grounds for optimism as for pessimism. Exactly the same grounds, in fact. That is because we are human. We still have every potential for good we have ever had, and the same presumptive claim to respect, our own respect and one another's. We are still creatures of singular interest and value. There's that kind of value thing, for me, the image of God thing. Agile of soul as we have always been, and as we will continue to be, even despite our errors and depredations, for as long as we abide on this earth. To value one another is our greatest safety, and to indulge in fear and contempt is our gravest error. I think that last line is just, I used to kind of have it on a Post-it note above my computer at work, because when you're working in media, there are a lot of things where it's easy to have a fearful response or a response of contempt for people who say things that you think are just ridiculous. But if we don't value the people who disagree with us, it makes it very difficult for us to achieve anything together.
You also reference the second law of thermodynamics in your book, and this is that we inherently move towards chaos and what is the word?
Entropy.
Entropy. But that we need to constantly be working on it, even just to stay in the same place.
Yeah, and one of the texts that I use for this, which comes from the Bible, from the Jewish scriptures, the Book of Ecclesiastes, which is a very kind of shocking, it feels almost nihilistic as a book. And it's the kind of famous, like, meaningless, everything is meaningless. There's nothing new under the sun. Everything, the water flows this way and then it flows that way and nothing changes. And it really kind of brings out that sense of like, oh, what's the point in any of this? But the teacher in that book also has that passage made famous by the bird song. There is a time for everything, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to scatter stones, a time to gather them, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, all that kind of seasonal sense, that sense of rhythm to human life. So I look at those two kind of passages, or those two kind of moods towards the chaos and the frustration of living in the world that we do. And I go, actually, I think this is a helpful picture for our political reality and how we engage with it, because it can become very disillusioning to be like, why does everything always go to pot? Like, why doesn't anything ever stay put? And I think particularly if we are over-optimistic, actually, about human nature or human achievements, if we go, oh, everything's getting better and better, and surely we can just sort out this problem and that problem, and then things go wrong. Politicians prove to be less than honest, or upright, and things get undone. The other party, whoever they are, get into power. We can become very disillusioned with each other. And it's almost like a game of whack-a-mole, like no problem ever stays fixed. You have to keep keep going, keep going, keep going. You know, this is the story of like educating every generation, right? You can never just fix something in place and be like, okay, we've got it sorted. Democracy is the best. Democracy is like sorted. It's become very clear that that's not the case. You actually have to argue for it, and you have to gear up to be like, okay, this requires a lot of effort just to stay in the same place.
You know, it's interesting because I think this idea that it requires constant attention and nurturing to move it along, when I read that, I kind of thought, wow, this is so much like I know in my own relationship that I love coming up with solutions. And I think that's a very male thing, whereas women tend to are more interested in the process. And I think part of our problem in society is that we've given too many men too much power. There it is. I said
Become
it.
too interested in the quick fix.
Yes. And yet we need to be more focused on the process. And I think actually it's interesting to take that a little bit further and look at the countries that have fared very well in our world, as to how many of those have been led by men and how many have led by women. And I grant that Scott Morrison has done very well in Australia, but I feel in a way that he wasn't given much choice when Jacinda Ardern went hard and fast or low.
Well,
whatever.
and Gladys has done very well.
And Gladys has done very well as well. And so has Daniel Andrews and all that. But anyway,
Anastasia, depending who you ask.
Yes, I know. Well, let's not go. We won't go through the whole world, but I think the idea of process rather than focused on solution, and I've got that right, let's move on, is not a particularly helpful way of thinking of the world.
Yeah, well, and I think as well, there's a question here about, humility is one way of putting it, being willing to be wrong. And I wonder if this is a thing that we will agree, but also maybe partly disagree on. You know, we started out talking about, you said something like, I think we believe that humans are mostly good, are basically good, which I half agree with, but also don't, right? And this comes out of my Christian worldview as well, that I go, well, the Bible does say actually we're amazing, made in the image of God. Mm-hmm. There's something brilliant about humans, agile of soul, as Marilyn Robinson puts it. But also there's something really bleak and dark and twisted, distorted at the heart of humans. We are messed up and we mess things up, and to an astounding extent, actually. Like you think that things are going to be okay, and that just if we have the right amount of education or whatever it is, surely it's going to be okay. And humans let each other down again and again. And I think that's almost part of the problem with this kind of quick fix mentality, is that if we think that humans are basically good, then we'll constantly be surprised and disillusioned when humans do awful things and fail at lots of things. And even the whole system of democracy is based on this idea. You know, you can oppose like something like the French Revolution, just based on this idea of like the perfectibility of humans. If you can just get the right system, you know, kind of same with communism. If you can just get the right system, humans are basically good, so it will all be swell. Whereas actually the idea of democracy is humans cannot be trusted. Like humans are messed up and mess things up. And therefore you have to put in these checks and balances. You have to put this system, which is itself messy and imperfect, and the outcomes are not always stellar, but there's a safety there, that we don't give humans too much power, and we don't expect that humans are going to necessarily make good choices. And that's why we need to build that into the system. That's kind of the best we've got. And if we're not kind of making that argument over and over again, then no wonder in surveys, young people kind of go, is democracy the best system? I don't know. Maybe autocracy will work out a bit better. I'm a bit disillusioned with this democracy thing. It doesn't seem to, achieve that much. Whereas actually it's very hard to achieve anything.
Right. Well, I don't want to go around into a theological discussion, but it's interesting because I do think original sin has a really big part to play in Christianity, and I describe myself honestly as an agnostic Jew, And so I often joke with my Christian friends and say, the difference between Christians and Jews, certainly agnostic Jews, is that Christians, if they sin, will go to hell. And yet, if Jews sin, they're going to make their mother very angry. And I'm not sure which is worse. Okay, so, but anyway, let's not get down that rabbit hole. Look, we've covered some great territory here, and I wanted to take a step back from your role in the public Christianity movement there, and as an academic too, and a Ph.D. in English, which taking a step back from all of that, because we're all on a health journey together in our modern world. And I wondered if you might share with us what you thought was the biggest challenge in that journey for an individual.
Sorry, in my journey, like my professional journey?
Yeah, no, just personal journey. We're all trying to be as healthy as we can. We're all trying to make as much sense of the world as we can. And in this modern world, what do you think the biggest challenge is for individuals?
Great question. I don't know if I feel like I should have prepped for this one.
Oh, well, I
don't know about like if I'm going to nail like this is the
That's okay. That's okay.
That one that comes to mind that has become very important to me, and I think actually this came out of the final year of my PhD, and it's the question of rest, which is of course something that you've thought about a lot, I know, and have done a lot of work on. And not expressly about sleep, but about we have this culture of productivity, what I would call the tyranny of productivity for a lot of us, where we feel like if we're not achieving something all of the time, then what's the point? And there's a lot that's bound up with that historically and sociologically and all the rest of it. But in the middle of just before I started the third year of my PhD, I read a paragraph. It's all about reading for me, right? Books is where I get started. And this also kind of comes from the angle of my faith. I was reading a book by William Wilberforce, and he made a kind of comment in passing in this book about Sabbath, which is a gift that that Judaism has given to the world, and via Christianity as well. This idea of one day out of every 7, you just cease from work. You may do no work. It was it's one of the 10 commandments. You and your maidservant and your ox, all of you must not work on this day, which is kind of astonishing as like a fundamental command, a religious command. Don't do any work, stop working. But I kind of wasn't really doing that because, Christians are like, oh, it's, like it's figurative and all the rest of it. But actually, because doing a PhD, I had become very like, I feel guilty all the time that I'm not working. I can't work all the time, so I don't, but I, always feel like I should be. And so I get really just tired and guilty and worried. And so I started every Sunday just being like, nope, no work is allowed on this day. I can do whatever I like. I can hang out with people and not feel angsty about it. I can read stuff that's purely for fun and not for work. And it completely transformed my life, actually, because just having that space that productivity can't encroach on. Nothing is demanded of you. You are not in charge of the world. The world is going to get by just fine without you. You can leave your to-do list for a while. And I think particularly these days, we actually have to cultivate the capacity for proper rest. It's easy to treat even recreation and play as a sort of achieving something, having meditation apps where you tick off goals. Like, what are we doing? That is not how that works. So it's, something I am doing better at sometimes and worse at sometimes, but rest, I think, is a big one for me.
Well, what a great note to finish on. And Natasha, thank you so much for joining us. And we will, of course, have links to your book and the documentary and the centre as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you'll know that I often ask my guest what they think the biggest challenge is on our health journey moving forward through this modern world. And I think it's a great question because people come up with different answers and sometimes similar answers from a slightly different perspective. And actually, we are going to put all those answers together in a whole book because I think they deserve to be. There are some real pearls, and I thought it was terrific that Natasha actually mentioned rest and drew on the Sabbath as a good example for that enforced, legitimized ability to rest on a regular basis, because we've on this podcast spoken many times about sleep, and people can get pretty stressed out if they're not sleeping. And I think that's actually a really important message that Natasha shared with us, and a good reminder for me to remind you that we should never underestimate the power of rest and the importance of it. And interestingly, the podcast I did with the sleep whisperer, Dr. Chris Winter, it would have been a year or two ago, he also discussed the power and the importance of rest. So that was a timely reminder. And I think when I read Natasha's book, The Pleasures of Pessimism, and we are surrounded by so much pessimism, it's such a wonderful read. It's not a long book. It's only around 50 or 60 pages, but it's beautifully written. And I heard her give a public presentation on this very subject. So I just thought it was so worth sharing that with you. And the documentary that I referenced as well that she had done is really worth looking at. And I really enjoyed the book, and I enjoyed the documentary, and I certainly enjoyed talking to Dr. Natasha more. And we will have links to all of her, the sites that she mentioned, and also to that questionnaire, which I'd encourage you all to do, from Hans Rosling, the Swedish doctor, statistician, who asks these 12 or 13 questions to sort of give you an idea of how in touch you are with the reality of what is actually going on in this world. So I hope you found that enjoyable. I certainly did. Now, don't forget, again, we're kicking off a new year and we want to really promote this podcast. And with your help, we can do that. So spend a moment and just share a review on iTunes to push us up the ratings and get this message out to a much broader audience. Again, we've got some great stuff on this year. Download the app Unstressed with Dr. Ron Ehrlich. It will keep you in touch with all that is going on. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.